Apple Siri has perhaps the best potential for deep integrated AI where it can control your apps. But we have not seen Apple make nearly the same level of investments as Meta and Google, for instance. And earlier this year, they have been facing threats for tariffs. And now they're facing an exodus where executives are leaving the company. So what the hell is going on at Apple, and should you be buying Apple stock right now? Earlier this year, Apple faced a lot of uncertainty because of tariffs. There has been a push by the current administration to build everything inside the USA, including an American-made iPhone. But this caused investors to panic at Liberation Day, where it was announced that there was going to be a 25% tariff on all imported goods from China, which would also affect Apple. And as a result, Apple stock crashed more than 20% in the following days. But is an American-made iPhone actually possible? Well, many said that would not be possible, or at least not a low-cost iPhone. It would in fact cost more than $3,000 if it were to be American-made. So while there's a desire, there's actually not much that Apple can do to make a low-cost iPhone that's made inside the USA. Because it's not only the Chinese labor that's cheaper, it's also the talent required to make such a product. See here what Tim Cook has to say about China, for example.
China stopped being the low labor cost country many years ago. And that is not the reason to come to China from a supply point of view. The reason is because of the skill and the quantity of skill in one location and the type of skill it is. Like the products we do require really advanced tooling. And the precision that you have to have in tooling and working with the materials that we do are state of the art. And the tooling skill is very deep here. You know, in the US, you could have a meeting of tooling engineers, and I'm not sure we could fill the room. In China, you could fill multiple football fields.
So instead of focusing on an American-made iPhone, Apple did announce $600 billion to be invested in America over the next 5 years. So let's break it down here. First of all, this was not a new plan by Apple. It was already an existing plan, but because of the push by the administration, they increased the amount from $500 to $600 billion. So how are they going to spend that money? Well, one is that Apple is building a 250,000 square foot facility that will manufacture Apple-made chips within the USA in Texas. So this means that Apple is joining Google in making their own chips. I've made a separate video on Google's TPUs, where it could potentially rival Nvidia with a total revenue of about $10 billion over time. And Apple seems to be joining that trend as well, with making its own facility that will produce chips too. Apart from that, Apple has its own fund, its Advanced Manufacturing Fund. And the purpose of this fund is to invest in US homegrown companies to help with the supply chain of the Apple products. So for example, they've made a $2.5 billion commitment to invest in Kentucky to help with its production of iPhone glass. Then they're also offering manufacturing training for US businesses in Detroit. Then they have a $500 million partnership to produce rare earth-based magnets in the US. It's very interesting to see how this Advanced Manufacturing Fund works, because unlike investing directly in a company, they're not actually receiving equity. So instead, they make a deal with the company they're going to invest. So for example, they say, okay, we will pay for your machines, but we want to receive the first 10 million units that come off the production line. So after they made all of this investment inside the US, now they're exempt from electronics imported from China. The second blow that Tim Cook avoided this summer had to do with Google's antitrust trial. Google is paying Apple $20 billion to be the default search on Safari. That's around 24% of their total services revenue. Now, because this happened in a period where OpenAI was on the rise and the question whether Google search was going to remain in market dominance was up in the air, the judge decided not to follow through on any action. Now, this was of course great news for Apple because those $20 billion would go directly into the pockets of them. Now, Apple is also facing an exodus of their executives. We've seen a lot of news where we see that executives are actually leaving the company of Apple. One example is that their general counsel, Kate Adams, and their head of policy and environment, Lisa Jackson, will both retire next year. One of their top designers has left for Meta, Alan Dye. He's been responsible, if you see here, for one, the packaging and unboxing experience that helped shape Apple's first impression, but many other things. like iOS 7 with the flat UI, which is revolutionary at the time, Apple Watch UI, Dynamic Island, led the UI for spatial computing, Apple Vision Pro launch, led the design of liquid glass, and has now introduced a unified language for all of Apple's devices. Apple's AI chief John Giannandrea is reportedly stepping down. This could signal that Apple's internal team were not able to make an AI model on time and instead have to opt for adopting Google's Gemini, which they have now announced to do. In his place, someone from Google who oversaw the chatbot experience from Gemini will join, Amar Subramanya. And if that's not all, both their COO and CFO announced their retirement. And earlier this year, Johnny Ive sold his startup I.O. to OpenAI to rival the iPhone. He was key in leading the design of the original iPhone and many other Apple products. Moving on from the departures at Apple, they also were reportedly working on an Apple car. Project Titan it was called. Now this was a very secretive project, but they decided to shut it down after investing about $10 billion into it. The reason why it shut down is probably because they usually demand a high markup from their products, and they realized that they could not sell an Apple car for the price that they probably wanted, especially in the face of competitors like Tesla and Chinese EVs entering the market. Combine that with the fact that they wanted full self-driving cars in their automobiles, but they were only able to achieve level 2, so they decided to shut it down. All the engineers were moved over to other projects related to generative AI. Now, it's also been reported that they're working on 2 new products. One is a kitchen arm. So you have to imagine that this is going to be like an iPad that follows you around so that you can do like Zoom calls or FaceTime calls inside your kitchen. The second thing is a robot that can follow you around inside your home. Now, if this is going to be a full-fledged robot or a robot with a screen, who knows? But these are the things that they're supposedly going to announce in the future. Then let's also talk about Apple Intelligence, because Apple's stance towards AI is a little bit different from the competitors. Like one, they really value privacy. So they have a different tiered approach where the first tier is that they want AI to run on your own device. So your data will remain on your device and will not go to any cloud. But if that's not possible because of, let's say, complex computation, they will move it to their own private compute cloud, which is going to be encrypted, meaning that no one knows exactly what data is being computed, including Apple themselves. And if that's not enough, then with your consent, they will move it to OpenAI. But recently, they were in talks with Google and with Anthropic to adopt an AI for their internal ecosystem, and they decided to move with Google's Gemini. One of the reasons is that despite the fact that Anthropic might be better suited for technical areas, Google in fact has proven to be able to scale to the level of needs that Apple would require from their customers. So now that you know the ins and outs of what's going on at Apple, should you be buying Apple stock right now? Well, first of all, let's have a look at the iPhone sales. Here we're looking at an article from IDC. It says here, Apple is set to have a record year in 2025 with shipments forecast to cross 247 million units, thanks to the phenomenal success of its latest iPhone 17 series, said Nabila Popal, Senior Research Director with IDC's Worldwide Quarterly Mobile Phone Tracker. In China, Apple's largest market, massive demand for iPhone 17 has significantly accelerated Apple's performance. It ranked first in October and November per IDC's China's monthly data sales, with more than 20% share, miles ahead of the competition, leading IDC to revise Apple's Q4 forecast in China from 9% to 17% year over year. So they've increased their forecast by quite a substantial amount. Furthermore, this turns a previously projected 1% decline in China for 2025 into a positive 3% growth. So they had actually projected a decline from last year's projections, and now it's gone to a positive growth number. Then another research firm, Counterpoint, it said that iPhone 17 outsold last year's iPhone 16 by 14% during the first 10 days in China and the US, which are Apple's 2 largest markets. In China, the base model iPhone 17 has been the biggest winner, and the iPhone Air, despite having less sales than the other models, actually had more sales than the previous year's iPhone 16 Plus. Despite all the turmoil though, Apple's stock has actually increased by around 39% in the last 6 months alone. So should you be buying Apple right now? Well, let's have a look at some of the fundamentals. The first thing is if you actually compare Apple's growth with other companies such as Meta, Google, Nvidia, then you see that actually Apple is lacking in growth compared to these other companies. Another thing to note is actually the valuation, because if we compare Apple's valuation with the average of the S&P, then we see that Apple's valuation is actually elevated compared to the S&P's average. So you're getting basically a higher premium that you're paying because the valuation is higher, and you're getting a slower growth rate. We've also had confirmation that Apple's internal AI model is not up to the same level as Gemini. So despite the fact that Apple does have deep integration potential, its own models are still behind. So you're probably better off waiting for Apple to confirm whether they're going to sell server chips. Well, because then they're going to compete with Nvidia, just like Google's TPUs potentially could do. Another thing to note is that despite these forecast increases of these research firms of the iPhone sales, it's probably still not enough to compete with the likes of Nvidia or Microsoft or Google. These companies, they are growing at a faster pace than Apple. So Apple is more of a defensive stock if you ask me. It's not really a stock to invest in if you're looking for massive potential in the future. Those days of Apple have been past. Of course, we know that Warren Buffett has benefited from those days. But recently, Warren Buffett announced investment in Google, for example. Apple is still unclear how they are going to capitalize on the AI boom. Perhaps they can do a similar model where they allow deep integration with apps, but they charge a fee for it, similar to the App Store. But at the moment, there's not really a clear case to invest in Apple. If you like this video and you think it was valuable, please consider giving me a like and a thumbs up. It doesn't cost you anything. I would really appreciate the support because I'm just starting out with making videos. Thank you.